What the hell is the Prime Minister going on about?
I will start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you.
He's a coward. He's a coward.
Britain has just been shaken to its core. Tonight, history has been made in the most shocking way imaginable. Keir Starmer, the man who promised to clean up British politics, has been forced out after the Supreme Court delivered a brutal and unprecedented ruling that sent shockwaves through Westminster and left the nation in utter chaos. The judges did not mince their words. They declared that the Prime Minister had betrayed the trust of the people, violated the law and disgraced the very office he swore to protect. In one sentence, they tore apart the image of a leader who built his career on integrity, and in one ruling, they left him clinging to power in total disgrace. Tonight, Britain is not calm, it is not stable, it is erupting. Protests are exploding across the streets, Parliament is in meltdown, and the entire country is asking one burning question. If the Prime Minister is no longer above the law, then how long can he survive in office? For years, Keir Starmer sold himself as the antidote to Britain's broken politics. He told the public he was the lawyer who fought for justice, the man of principle who would stand up for truth in a sea of corruption, the reformer who would sweep away the filth of Westminster. And millions believed him. They voted for him not because they loved Labour, but because they believed he was different. Calm, steady, professional and untouchable by scandal. This was the image carefully projected by the man who now sits in Downing Street. But tonight, that image has shattered into pieces because when the Supreme Court ruled, they didn't just expose a clerical mistake or a minor misstep. They exposed something far darker. They accused the Prime Minister of deception, of dishonesty, and of betraying the very foundation of trust between the government and the people. And in that one devastating ruling, Britain's so-called saviour has been recast as Britain's greatest fraud. The road to this shocking downfall began quietly, almost invisibly. A missing figure on a property record, £124,000 unaccounted for. At first, it looked like a mistake, something that could be brushed aside with a quick explanation. But money leaves trails, and those trails led investigators straight into a web of hidden luxury. Designer suits worth thousands, fine wines delivered in secret, private jet flights never declared, all gifted by billionaire donors who somehow always seem to benefit from government policy. This was not the clean, honest, transparent politics that Starmer had promised. This was cronyism at its most brazen, corruption wrapped in the cloak of respectability, and it was happening right under the nose of the man who vowed to bring integrity back to government. Westminster tried to bury it. Allies claimed it was nothing more than a witch hunt, a desperate smear campaign by his enemies. They told the public to ignore the noise. But the noise only grew louder because the evidence was undeniable. Each new discovery tore another hole in the carefully constructed myth of Starmer's integrity. And then came the moment no one thought would ever happen in Britain, the Supreme Court stepping in and declaring the Prime Minister himself had violated the law. The courtroom was silent as the judgment was read aloud. The words were clinical, cold and final. No one is above the law, not even the Prime Minister. That single sentence sent shockwaves not just through Westminster, but through the entire country. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was instant and explosive. Protesters who had gathered erupted into cheers, waving placards that read, "Resign now," and "Justice for Britain." Live television cameras captured scenes of people crying tears of relief, others screaming with anger that it had taken this long. The chants of the crowd echoed through Parliament Square like thunder. "Starmer out! Starmer out!" Inside Westminster, MPs were left stunned. Some sat in silence, heads in their hands, while others whispered furiously in corridors about what this meant for the survival of the government. Members of Starmer's own party looked broken, as if the ground had been ripped from under them. Across the chamber, the opposition smelled blood and wasted no time. Calls for his resignation erupted instantly, while demands for a snap general election began dominating the airwaves. But while the public celebrated and Parliament panicked, inside Number 10, Keir Starmer made a choice that turned scandal into full-blown crisis. Instead of accepting the judgment, instead of bowing to the authority of the highest court in the land, he refused. He told his closest aides that he would not resign, not now, not ever. And with those words, Britain entered uncharted territory. This was no longer just about a crooked politician clinging to power. This was about something far bigger, far more dangerous. What happens when the Prime Minister of Britain refuses to follow the rule of law? As night fell over London, the streets swelled with fury. Thousands poured into Parliament Square, waving banners and chanting louder than ever. Police in riot gear formed barricades as the protests spread through Whitehall and Trafalgar Square. The chants of "No one is above the law" rang out like a war cry, echoing across the capital. Social media exploded with viral footage of angry crowds clashing with police. Videos of protesters confronting officers and screaming that Britain was no longer a democracy if the law could not touch its leader. The nation that once prided itself on stability and order was suddenly teetering on the edge of chaos. And yet, even as the chants grew louder and the pressure mounted, Keir Starmer remained inside number 10, defiantly holding his ground. The man who had built his career on law and justice was now openly defying both. Advisors begged him to reconsider, warning him that every minute he refused to obey the Supreme Court was another minute closer to Britain's political system collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy. But Starmer's response was simple, cold and unflinching. "I have the mandate of the people. I will not go." The words were not the calm reassurance of a steady leader. They were the fiery defiance of a man cornered, of a politician who had crossed the line between power and law. And with that defiance, Britain's crisis deepened. What had begun as a corruption scandal had now turned into a battle between the courts and the Prime Minister himself, a battle that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of the Constitution. And as London burned with outrage, the world was left staring in disbelief at the once stable nation now spiralling into uncharted waters. But this is only the beginning. Because the deeper investigators dug, the more sinister the story became, and what they uncovered next would send Britain into an even darker chapter, one that no one could have imagined. The question now is not just whether Starmer can survive, but whether Britain itself can hold together when its leader refuses to obey the law. And if the Prime Minister will not leave, then what happens next? As dawn broke over London, the city that once embodied order and civility was now transformed into a cauldron of unrest. The streets surrounding Parliament Square were flooded with thousands of demonstrators, people who had travelled from every corner of Britain to demand justice, to demand that the man who betrayed their trust step down immediately. Flares painted the morning sky red, the sound of drums, ahs and chanting reverberating through Whitehall like a warning siren. Each march, each placard, each roar of the crowd was a reminder that this was no longer merely a political scandal. It was a national uprising. Social media channels were overflowing with footage of the chaos, videos showing protesters confronting police barricades, shouting at officers, some even climbing statues and pillars in their desperation to be heard. The hashtag Starmer Resign trended worldwide, making Britain the centre of global attention as foreign media broadcasted images of a nation on the verge of collapse. Inside the walls of Downing Street, the atmosphere was suffocating. Starmer's inner circle was shrinking by the hour as trusted aides quietly resigned, unwilling to be part of a government openly defying the highest court. Senior civil servants walked out, leaving offices empty and operations paralysed, while whispers of mutiny began circulating in the corridors of power. Intelligence briefings warned that extremist groups were exploiting the unrest, calling for violent disruption, and reports suggested that if the Prime Minister did not step down soon, the nation could face an escalation the likes of which had not been seen in modern British history, and yet Starmer refused to yield. Each hour that passed seemed to harden his resolve, as if the defiance itself had become an addiction, a declaration that he alone could define what authority meant in Britain. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court's ruling had unleashed more than protests. It had triggered a political earthquake across Parliament itself. Members of Starmer's Labour Party were fractured, split into bitter camps of support and opposition. Some demanded that he resign immediately, fearful that delay would lead to more violence and deeper chaos. Others clung to the hope that Starmer could weather the storm, that he could somehow survive this unprecedented assault on his leadership. The opposition, sensing weakness, pounced immediately. Every channel, every platform, every broadcast became a weaponised space where calls for a snap election, demands for his resignation, and accusations of criminal misconduct were broadcast with merciless intensity. Political commentators, normally measured and restrained, spoke in alarmist tones, warning that Britain was teetering on the brink of constitutional collapse and that the actions or inactions of the Prime Minister could permanently scar the nation. Then came the deeper revelations that would ignite the firestorm further. As investigators from Scotland Yard and the Supreme Court's independent auditors traced Starmer's financial records, a darker and more intricate web emerged. Offshore accounts in the Isle of Man, shell companies in Jersey, and wire transfers from shadowy billionaire donors began to surface, revealing a pattern that suggested not just negligence, but deliberate misconduct. One transaction stood out, a £52,000 transfer from a defence contractor linked to a £1 billion weapons deal, completely unaccounted for. The auditors labelled it in no uncertain terms, effectively a bribe. And as the news leaked to the public, the nation's anger reached a new crescendo. Protesters became more emboldened, police struggled to contain the swelling crowds, and Parliament found itself paralysed as emergency meetings were called behind closed doors. Every hour that passed without action seemed to signal that the law itself was powerless to stop the Prime Minister. The monarchy, long a silent observer of political crises, was forced into the spotlight. King Charles, having remained in Balmoral for weeks, returned to London under urgent circumstances. Rumours swirled of emergency meetings with constitutional advisers, discussions of invoking historic powers to dismiss a Prime Minister who openly defied the law. The mere suggestion that the Crown might intervene sent tremors through financial markets, with the pound dropping sharply and British stocks plunging as investors panicked. NATO allies and European leaders began to voice unease, while Washington issued rare statements urging Britain to restore stability immediately. The world was watching, and the image of Britain as a stable, reliable democracy was unravelling with each passing hour. Inside Number 10, Starmer's defiance was almost palpable. Meetings with advisers turned tense and combative, with aides urging him to acknowledge the severity of the situation. Each suggestion of resignation was met with cold refusal, each warning about escalating unrest answered with fiery insistence that he still carried the people's mandate. His defiance became a spectacle, a symbol of power clashing with law, and the question on everyone's lips shifted from what did he do to what will he do next. The tension was no longer just political, it was existential. Britain was now asking itself whether its constitution, its legal system, and its centuries-old democratic principles could survive a Prime Minister who refused to obey the law. And as the hours stretched into the second day of this crisis, new intelligence revealed that the unrest was spreading beyond London. Protests erupted in Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow and Cardiff, turning city centres into battlegrounds of chants, banners and confrontation. Supply chains were disrupted, transportation halted, and every news cycle amplified the growing sense of a country on the brink. Public services reported strains, businesses shuttered early, and the question hanging over every citizen was stark. How far would this defiance go before it descended into something irreversible? The deeper investigators dug, the darker it became. Whistleblowers within Starmer's own party began speaking out, revealing a culture of intimidation, threats and silence. Staffers described offices where questioning financial dealings could mean immediate dismissal, and internal memos suggested that key decisions were being made not for public interest but to protect the Prime Minister's personal network of wealth and influence. Each revelation added fuel to the fire, turning public outrage into a near-mass hysteria. And as the Supreme Court's judgment was dissected in painstaking detail, the people realised that this was not a temporary scandal. It was a systemic betrayal at the very highest levels of power. And yet, even with London, the nation and the world watching, Starmer remained unyielding. His resolve had become a rallying point for supporters, and a provocation to opponents, Parliament Square had become a flashpoint, and the possibility of violent confrontation was no longer hypothetical. With every hour, the tension escalated. With every news report, the outrage multiplied. The question now was no longer about guilt or innocence, about scandal or misconduct. It was about survival. If Starmer refuses to step down, how far will Britain go to reclaim its law and order? What happens when a Prime Minister becomes a law unto himself? London, the city once known for its order and quiet resilience, now resembled a city under siege. Parliament Square had transformed into a sprawling encampment of protesters, thousands deep, their banners swaying violently in the wind, their chants echoing endlessly, "Justice! Justice! Resign!" Flares lit the sky, casting a crimson glow over the capital as megaphones amplified cries of outrage. Every major road in the heart of the city was blocked, and emergency services struggled to maintain a fragile semblance of order. From Downing Street, the Prime Minister observed the growing chaos like a chess player considering his next move, seemingly untouched by the storm raging just beyond his gates. But the storm was now beyond control. What started as a scandal over missing funds and hidden gifts had exploded into a full-scale political rebellion, with ordinary citizens demanding not just resignation but accountability, transparency and justice at every level of government. The revelations coming from investigators were relentless. Forensic accountants working alongside Scotland Yard began publishing reports of staggering scale. Offshore accounts traced to Starmer's closest donors revealed a labyrinth of payments, transfers and shell companies that could only be described as meticulously designed to hide financial corruption. Each new discovery was more shocking than the last. Luxury vacations mysteriously funded, private jet flights logged in obscure financial statements, multi-million-pound donations from corporations that received favourable contracts almost immediately. The Supreme Court's verdict now seemed almost mild in comparison to what was emerging. The Prime Minister, the man who promised to fight corruption, had in fact become its most brazen example in modern British history. Meanwhile, within Westminster, panic had turned into outright fear. Senior members of the Labour Party convened secret meetings behind closed doors, desperate to salvage what remained of their credibility. Whispers of rebellion within the party grew louder as MPs debated whether to break ranks and call for an immediate leadership challenge. But even as allies considered defiance, Starmer remained immovable, issuing statements accusing the Supreme Court of political overreach and claiming that he alone carried the mandate of the British people. Every statement, every public address seemed to pour gasoline onto an already raging fire. Instead of quelling protests, Starmer's rhetoric inflamed the masses further. Across London and the rest of Britain, citizens now questioned the very foundation of their democracy. What happens when the Prime Minister openly flouts the highest court? What happens when the law is powerless against the man elected to enforce it? The crisis had now taken on an international dimension. Global media descended on London, broadcasting images of barricades, flares and clashing protesters to billions of viewers worldwide. Investors panicked as markets reeled from the uncertainty, the pound plummeting, British stocks falling sharply, and economists warning of a financial catastrophe if the political deadlock continued. Allies in Europe and North America expressed alarm, urging Britain to resolve the crisis, while NATO quietly questioned whether a nation whose leader openly defied the law could be relied upon in matters of global security. The stability of a centuries-old democracy was now under scrutiny from around the world, as every headline, every social media post and every news broadcast carried the same question. Can Britain survive the defiance of its Prime Minister? Back in number 10, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Starmer's aides reported a surreal combination of fear and loyalty. Some had quietly begun preparing exit strategies for themselves, knowing that their careers, and in some cases their personal safety, could be at risk if the standoff escalated further. Others remained devoted, convinced that loyalty to the Prime Minister outweighed even the Supreme Court's ruling. Meetings within the cabinet were described as tense, heated, and sometimes outright hostile. The country had entered a constitutional twilight zone, a sitting Prime Minister openly defying the judiciary, refusing to resign, and threatening the delicate balance between elected authority and the rule of law. And then came the intelligence reports that escalated fears to near hysteria. Analysts warned that extremist groups were exploiting the unrest, pushing for violence and planning large-scale disruption, targeting government buildings, transportation hubs and major city centres. Emergency services scrambled. Police reinforcements poured in from across the country, and the government quietly raised threat levels, fearing that the next spark could ignite something uncontrollable. London was no longer a city. It was a powder keg. Every moment that Starmer refused to step down increased the likelihood of bloodshed, and yet he remained resolute, convinced that defiance equalled strength. In the royal sphere, King Charles moved decisively. Buckingham Palace confirmed that urgent meetings with constitutional advisers were underway, exploring options that had remained dormant for nearly 2 centuries. The potential use of the royal prerogative, a power to dismiss a prime minister, was now being seriously discussed, something almost inconceivable in modern times. The palace's silence had ended, and whispers of intervention sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. Markets trembled, politicians scrambled, and the world watched, waiting to see if the Crown would finally step into a constitutional showdown with Number 10. The revelations from the investigation kept coming. Whistleblowers from within Starmer's own administration began coming forward, describing systematic intimidation, threats of dismissal, and a culture of silence that had been enforced at the highest levels of government. One aide revealed that questioning financial deals could result in immediate termination, and internal communications indicated that decisions had been made to protect Starmer personally rather than the nation. It was a portrait of government operating less as a democratic institution and more as a syndicate, safeguarding a single individual from accountability. As London burned with protest, Parliament remained gridlocked, global eyes were fixed on Britain, and Starmer's defiance remained unbroken. The nation was now forced to confront a terrifying possibility that its leader might remain in power, even as he violated the law and eroded the very foundations of democracy. And with each passing hour, the tension escalated further, teetering on the edge of chaos that could spiral completely out of control. How far will the people go to reclaim the rule of law? And if the Prime Minister refuses to step down, will Britain itself fracture beyond repair? London, once the symbol of order and civility, had become a battlefield of outrage. Parliament Square was swarmed with tens of thousands of protesters, their voices raw with fury, their chants shaking the city's foundations. Resign! Resign. No one is above the law. Flares streaked across the sky, illuminating a sea of placards demanding justice, while clashes with police erupted at every turn. Barricades were torn down, vehicles blocked the streets, and emergency services struggled to maintain control. From Downing Street, Starmer watched the chaos with a steely gaze, isolated within walls, fortified against the very citizens he had promised to serve. Every second of inaction amplified the tension, turning the streets into a pressure cooker of anger, fear, and defiance. Inside Number 10, the pressure was suffocating. Senior aides had either resigned or were quietly plotting their exit, knowing that staying loyal could mean being implicated in a government openly defying the law. Civil servants abandoned offices in droves, leaving a vacuum that paralysed government operations. Starmer's cabinet was fractured beyond repair as ministers openly debated whether to confront him, resign, or call for a leadership challenge. Every moment he remained in power, every word he uttered refusing to resign, drove Britain closer to a constitutional catastrophe. Analysts warned that continued defiance could provoke violent unrest. Yet the Prime Minister remained resolute, his defiance bordering on obsession. The investigation into his finances had reached unprecedented depths. Forensic accountants traced hidden transactions across continents, uncovering offshore accounts in the Isle of Man, Jersey, and the Cayman Islands. Secret wire transfers from billionaire donors tied to lucrative government contracts were documented in meticulous detail. One of the most explosive revelations involved a £52,000 transfer from a defence contractor linked to a £1 billion weapons deal, a bribe in all but name. Whistleblowers from inside the Labour Party painted a grim picture of intimidation, threats and enforced silence, revealing a government operating less like a democracy and more like a syndicate designed to protect the Prime Minister at all costs. The Supreme Court's initial ruling now seemed almost mild compared to the scale of deception unfolding in real time. As the crisis deepened, Buckingham Palace moved decisively. King Charles returned from Balmoral, engaging in urgent consultations with constitutional advisers. The possibility of invoking the royal prerogative, the power to dismiss a Prime Minister, was no longer theoretical. Markets responded immediately, the pound plummeted, British stocks nosedived, and international allies voiced alarm. NATO allies quietly questioned Britain's reliability, European leaders convened emergency discussions, and the United States issued rare statements warning that the crisis threatened both domestic stability and global confidence in London. For the first time in living memory, the monarchy was actively considering a direct intervention in political affairs, a step that could spark a clash with Number 10 of historic proportions. Outside, the protests had escalated into near rebellion. Cities across the UK erupted as tens of thousands joined marches in Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow and Cardiff. Transportation was paralysed, businesses closed, and emergency services were stretched to their limits. Flares, drums and chants turned city centres into arenas of fury. Intelligence reports indicated that extremist factions were exploiting the chaos, preparing for large-scale disruption that could turn protests into widespread violence. Every hour, Starmer refused to resign. Every public address in which he claimed a mandate from the people fueled the anger, and the nation was now staring into an abyss where the breakdown of order felt inevitable. Inside Parliament, panic was palpable. Members of Starmer's own party were openly divided, some preparing to publicly confront him, others urging restraint, but all aware that the law itself was being challenged. The opposition smelled opportunity, pressing for an immediate vote of no confidence while the public's outrage grew into a tidal wave impossible to ignore. News channels, newspapers and social media amplified the crisis, broadcasting each new revelation, each violent protest, and every whispered rumour of palace intervention. Britain had become the epicentre of a constitutional storm, watched in disbelief by the entire world. Starmer had not merely misled the public, he had systematically undermined the rule of law, weaponised loyalty, and exploited the mechanisms of power to shield himself from accountability. The nation was no longer dealing with scandal, it was witnessing the unravelling of governance itself. And yet, through all this, Starmer remained defiant. Addressing the nation, he doubled down, accusing the Supreme Court of overreach, claiming the judgment was politically motivated and insisting he retained the mandate of the people. His words, fiery and combative, poured petrol onto a fire already raging out of control. The crowd outside Number 10 grew even more volatile, while Parliament became a crucible of fear, anger and indecision. The constitutional stakes had never been higher. The question now is simple but terrifying. If the Prime Minister will not step down, if the law cannot touch him, then what becomes of Britain itself?